My name's John Harris. One thing I cannot stand is when someone gets overly friendly and calls me Har. There is always that one obnoxious guy, tipsy or not, who acts too familiar. They ask, "So Har, what do you do for a living?" My go-to answer is usually, "Oh, I invented this nifty device for cops. It can detect if someone's drunk from 40 feet away." I even tell them it's getting mounted on radars around town. That typically shuts them up fast. Of course, that gadget is a total fabrication, but sometimes I just do not have the patience to deal with pointless conversations. I'm a simple man, really. I like my life straightforward, no unnecessary drama. I work as an engineer for a national company, one of those big names with offices all over the place. I enjoy my work, and I have a good set of friends. I am not the biggest drinker, but I won't turn down the occasional beer. Honestly, I love nachos more than anything, but I have to watch it. I am not trying to get out of shape, even though the temptation is real. Back in the day, I used to sail whenever I had the chance, but that stopped when life got busy. 2 kids and a wife do not exactly leave much time for solo trips out on the water. I ended up selling the boat, but I did not mind. Sacrifices like that felt worth it to spend time with my family. I've been married to Emily for 25 years. She's a high school teacher, and we have 2 amazing daughters, Sophie and Lucy. Sophie is over at Brown University in Rhode Island, and Lucy is at Boston University. They're both incredibly bright, so much so that they each earn scholarships. It's a good thing too, because I'm not sure we could have swung the tuition for both without some help. We live in North Carolina, in an area called the Research Triangle. It's a beautiful place, surrounded by top-tier universities and tech companies. Living here is pretty great. I could go on about the barbecue here, but that would just make me hungry. I won't lie, I was a little disappointed when the girls decided to go to college up north. I had pictured them staying closer to home, but I get it. They need to experience life on their own terms, and I think it's for the best. Watching them grow up, develop their own ideas, and make their own choices has been an incredible experience. With them away at school, I figured Emily and I would finally get more time for ourselves, something we hadn't had in years. I envisioned the next stage of our lives with a sense of excitement. With the kids away at college, I thought Emily and I would finally focus on each other. It felt like the perfect time to reconnect, like the early days of our marriage when everything was new and full of possibility. I pictured us sharing dinners at new restaurants, catching plays, or just enjoying quiet evenings at home rediscovering who we were. It was a hopeful idea, almost like falling in love all over again. But reality had different plans. Looking back now, I can see that the first year of our empty nest wasn't what I had expected. Emily began to change, though I didn't notice it immediately. At first, I figured it was natural. After all, the house was quieter, and we had more free time. She had more space to pursue her interests. But as time passed, the shifts in her behavior became more pronounced, and I began to realize something deeper was happening. Emily has always been passionate about writing. She teaches English and creative writing at the local high school, but she always saw herself as a writer first. She used to spend her summers and free evenings working on her short stories and essays, dreaming of getting published one day. The truth is, she's had a tough go of it. She's collected more rejection letters than she'd like to admit. And while I've always supported her passion, it's clear her dream of writing the next great novel hasn't panned out yet. Over the years, Emily joined several writing groups. Some seemed genuinely productive, with members critiquing each other's work and offering thoughtful advice. But others felt more like social clubs where people came to stroke each other's egos rather than improve their craft. Her most recent group, the one she was involved in when things started to unravel, was a mix of both. They met at each other's houses, taking turns hosting. When it was our turn, I made it a point to give them their space. I tried to sit in on a meeting once, but Emily's subtle disapproval, along with the cold reception from the group, made it clear I wasn't welcome. Emily's current group consisted of about 10 people, both men and women. Some were talented, others, not so much. There were a few I liked, like Morgan, who was dedicated to writing well-researched historical biographies. I had read some of her work and found it engaging. Then there was Lila, a fantasy writer. She wasn't aiming to be the next big thing, but her whimsical tales of talking animals seemed to make her happy. I had no problem with that. And then there was Greg. From the moment I met Greg, something felt off. He had a way of making his presence known, like everything revolved around him. When Emily introduced me to him, it felt like she was showing me off to him, rather than the other way around. I'll never forget the way he looked at me and asked, "So, Har, what do you do?" There was something condescending about the way he said it. Emily shot me a look, as if warning me not to make a big deal out of it. I simply replied, "I'm an engineer." Greg didn't smile. It was more like a smirk. And after that interaction, I made it a point to steer clear of the group whenever they met at our house. I didn't participate in there. I often found myself working quietly in the next room or sitting on the back porch with the window open, close enough to catch snippets of their conversations. At first, I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose, but as time passed, I noticed something between Emily and Greg that made me uneasy. When they talked, it was like they had some private connection, sharing little inside jokes and references that flew over everyone else's head. They seemed to have conversations that no one else in the group remembered. It made me feel like I was on the outside, watching something I wasn't supposed to see. I told Emily a few times that I didn't like it, that it rubbed me the wrong way. But she always brushed off my concerns, saying I was overthinking things. "It's just the group dynamic," she'd say. "Everyone is friendly." And for the most part, I let it go. I trusted her, after all. But something about Greg stuck with me, especially during those late-night meetings when the group would relax with a few glasses of wine after their writing sessions. One evening in March, the conversation shifted to something that made me pay more attention. The group started talking about the lifestyles of real writers. You know the type. Famous authors who were heavy drinkers, who wrote through the fog of booze and had passionate, messy affairs that supposedly fueled their creativity. Greg, naturally, was in the middle of the conversation, saying how romantic relationships were what really sparked great writing. Emily chimed in, and what she said hit me like a ton of bricks. "Oh, absolutely," she laughed. "It's the thrill of the unknown, the excitement of keeping it all a secret that brings out the real inspiration." I couldn't tell if it was a joke or if she meant it, but it felt like someone had punched me in the gut. A few people laughed, but I kept listening, hoping for some context that would make me feel less sick to my stomach. Then Tom, another guy in the group, joked, "Maybe we should all have a wild night of passion and then write the next great American novel." The room erupted in laughter, but I didn't find it funny. I couldn't tell if it was just meaningless chatter or something more. I remember thinking, is this how writers think? Is this normal? I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. And then, as they continued talking about writing workshops, drinking habits, and secret affairs, I heard Greg mention something that set off even more alarm bells. "Is anyone else applying for that Illinois Writers Workshop this summer?" Greg asked. I froze. This was news to me. Emily hadn't mentioned anything about it, but right away she responded, "Oh, I already applied. I'm just waiting to hear back." 6 weeks of nothing but writing and being around other writers. I feel like it could really take my work to the next level. 6 weeks? I hadn't even heard about this, but Greg had. He was clearly in the loop in a way that I wasn't. "You'll get in for sure," Greg said smoothly. "Your writing has grown so much. I bet you'll be accepted." It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was this tone of familiarity that I didn't appreciate. And what was worse, Emily seemed flattered. I sat there, frozen, listening to them talk like this, and all I could think was, what else have they been talking about that I don't know? Discussions, but I wasn't completely out of earshot either. That night, lying in bed, I could not shake the nagging feeling that had been growing since that overheard conversation in the kitchen. I trusted Emily. I always had. After 20 years together, trust was the foundation of everything we shared. Yet, something felt off now. The way she had been acting lately, distant, secretive, more engaged with her writing group than with me, was unsettling. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I mean, Emily had never given me a reason not to trust her. But that phone conversation, the excitement in her voice about the workshop, and especially the comment about no one waiting for her to come home, stuck with me. It did not sit right. It was the kind of thing that makes you pause, that little voice in the back of your head telling you something isn't adding up. Then came the news I knew was coming. I got in. Emily announced with this wide-eyed excitement that I had not seen from her in years. I got accepted into the Illinois Writers' Workshop. It's going to be an incredible opportunity. I forced a smile. That's fantastic, Emily. When does it start? Mid-June, she said, with that sparkle still in her eyes. 6 weeks of just writing, discussions with top authors, and no distractions. I'll be gone until late July. The idea of her being gone for 6 whole weeks, without me, made my stomach turn. It wasn't just the time apart. It was how thrilled she seemed to be about it. I suggested, almost offhandedly, that maybe I could take some time off work and join her for part of the trip. I had said it casually, but her reaction was anything but. Her face froze for just a second before she recovered with a too-quick smile. Oh, I don't know, AB. It's going to be really intense. I won't have a lot of free time, and you would probably find it dull anyway. You're not exactly into literary discussions. There it was again, that dismissiveness, the way she always talked down my interests whenever they collided with hers. She was shutting me out, and we both knew it. But I played along. Well, you know I'm not that demanding. Maybe I can be the coffee guy for the group, I joked, hoping to ease the tension. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That could be nice, dear. But let's just see how it goes, okay? That was when I knew. She had no intention of letting me come with her. And I had a gut feeling there was more to this than just a writer's workshop. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, I did something I never thought I would have to do in my marriage. I logged into our phone records through our AT&T account. Every call, every text message was there, laid out in front of me. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I could not shake the feeling that something was going on, and I needed to know. It didn't take long to find something. A number kept popping up, frequently. I scrolled through the records, noting that Emily had been texting this number several times a day. And the calls, they weren't long, just a few minutes here and there, but they were frequent. The name attached to the number? It wasn't Morgan. It was Greg. My heart sank as I stared at the screen. Greg, the guy from the writing group. The one who always seemed a little too familiar with my wife. The one who always seemed to know just the right thing to say to her. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a writing workshop. This was about something more. Something that had been happening right under my nose. When I overheard that conversation, I realized the situation was even worse than I had imagined. Emily wasn't just hiding something from me. She was plotting to keep me out of her life for those 6 weeks, and she was clearly talking to someone else. The affectionate tone, the baby, and the way she dismissed me, it all made sense now. I headed to Sam's place to cool off. Sam's been my best friend since we were kids, and if anyone could help me think through this mess, it was him. When I told him what I had overheard, he was as shocked as I was. There's no way, AB, he said, shaking his head. Emily's always seemed like the loyal type. You guys have been together forever. I know, Sam, I replied, but something's off. She's working really hard to keep me out of that workshop. She's making plans without me, calling someone else baby. It's not me, and I know it's not Morgan either. Who else could it be? Sam leaned back in his chair, thoughtful for a moment. You're sure it's not just a misunderstanding? I'm not sure of anything anymore, I sighed. But I need answers. We sat in silence for a while, just taking it all in. That's the thing about guys like Sam. We don't need a lot of talking, just someone to be there and listen. I appreciated that more than words at that moment. You know what you need to do, Sam finally said. You need to sit down and talk to her. Be upfront. Ask her what's going on. I guess that's the only way, I agreed, though deep down, I feared what her answers might be. Could I handle the truth if she admitted to having an affair? What if she denied it? Either way, the conversation needed to happen. When I got back home, I was determined to confront her, but Emily was already asleep. The tension gnawed at me all night, my mind running through 1,000 different scenarios. But I knew I couldn't wait much longer. Tomorrow, I would ask her directly. The next day, I found Emily in the kitchen, sipping her morning coffee and flipping through one of her writing journals. For a moment, she looked peaceful, and I almost second-guessed myself, but I knew what I had heard. Emily, I said, sitting down across from her, we need to talk. She glanced up at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "What's on your mind, AB?" I took a deep breath. "I've been hearing things, Emily. Things that don't add up. I know about the calls. I know you've been talking to someone you call baby. It's not me, and it's not Morgan. I think you owe me an explanation." Her face froze. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, tell me I was crazy, or make up some excuse. But instead, she set her coffee down slowly and looked me straight in the eye. "AB," she began, her voice measured, "there's something I need to tell you." That week felt like an eternity. After Emily's outburst, the house fell into a tense silence. She avoided me at every turn, her silence acting as a weapon, pushing me away without having to say a word. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to make me feel guilty for accusing her, trying to make me second-guess myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I realized that if she was planning to cheat, or if she already had, there was little I could do to stop it. The idea made my stomach churn, but the truth was clear. The phone conversation I had overheard played on repeat in my mind. Was she really involved with Greg? Or worse, was there someone else I didn't even know about? The unanswered questions kept me awake at night. I decided to change tactics. Instead of pressing her, I acted like I was backing down. I thanked her for the fishing trip, even though my heart wasn't in it. I told her I'd go, but I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to Canada. I was going to Illinois, and I was going to find out the truth. The day finally came when she left for the workshop. I watched her pack her bags, and I noticed something different in the way she moved. There was a certain lightness, a kind of eagerness that hadn't been there in years. It hurt more than I expected. "Good luck at the workshop," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. She gave me a quick smile. "Thanks, AB. Enjoy Canada." I nodded, pretending to go along with it, but as soon as her car disappeared down the driveway, I started packing. I had already booked my ticket to Illinois weeks before, and I had no intention of letting her know I was coming. When I arrived in Illinois, the first thing I did was head to the university where the workshop was being held. I didn't want to be seen, so I stayed in the background, watching from a distance. I knew Emily had a session that afternoon, so I waited outside the building, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw her. She walked out of the building with Greg. They were laughing, talking closely, and the way he touched her arm, it was more than just friendly. I felt a surge of anger, but I held myself back. I needed proof, something undeniable. I followed them as they walked across campus and down to a nearby cafe. They sat at a table outside, and I found a spot across the street where I could watch without being seen. For the next hour, I watched them talk, laugh, and lean in closer than two people who were just friends should. When Greg reached out and took her hand, that was it. I knew. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and sadness. This was it, the proof I needed. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear. My marriage would never be the same again. The private investigator gathered more than enough evidence to confirm my worst fears. Every update he sent only solidified what I already knew, that my wife, Emily, had moved on emotionally and physically with Greg. They didn't even try to hide it. Whether at the workshop or during their free time, they acted as if they were in a carefree relationship, with no regard for what was happening back home. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the video footage from the hallway outside their dorm room. My private investigators team had managed to position a small camera to capture what was going on behind closed doors. It was clear and undeniable. There was no more room for doubt. Watching that footage was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but at that moment, something inside me switched off. Any lingering feelings I had for her, any hope that we could somehow work through this, vanished. The most heartbreaking detail was how easily she seemed to throw everything away. We had spent years building a life together, raising our daughters, going through the highs and lows that come with any long-term relationship. But here she was, pretending as though none of it mattered, as though our marriage had been nothing more than an inconvenience she could discard at will. Once I had all the evidence I needed, I began planning my next steps. It was clear that my marriage was over, and I wasn't going to wait for her to come home to hash things out. I decided to disappear before she even had the chance to return. leaving her to come back to an empty house and the realization that her double life had consequences. When Emily returned, she'd be greeted with nothing but silence. The home we had built would feel hollow, just as I now felt. She would come back to a husband who had moved on, just as she had, only I was taking everything with me, including the dignity she had left behind. The next step was to contact my lawyer, ensuring that everything was set in place for the divorce. There would be no going back from this. Emily had crossed a line, and no amount of apologies or explanations would change that. My mind was made up. Destiny had taken its course, and I was committed to my plan. It wasn't easy to detach myself emotionally from Emily, but I knew it was the only way to preserve what was left of my dignity. Each day during her 6-week writing workshop, I laid the groundwork for my vanishing act. No explanations, no drawn-out confrontations, just a clean break. I had already lived through too much heartache to drag this out any longer. Emily always relied on my stability. Through every fight, every challenge in our marriage, I was her anchor. But now, I would be gone without a trace, leaving her to face the mess she created on her own. Greg? He wasn't the answer to her problems. I had seen enough of his type before. Charming, sure, but lacking the substance it takes to support someone through the ups and downs of life. He may have given her excitement, but excitement fades. What was she going to do when the high wore off? When the reality of a divorced, middle-aged woman set in, she'd come to regret her decisions, but by then, I would be long gone. Each time the private investigator sent me evidence, it felt like a stab to the heart. Pictures of them holding hands, kissing, laughing. It was clear that Emily had shed any semblance of loyalty she had once promised me. And the worst part? She was laughing at me behind my back, telling Greg that I was clueless for thinking she still cared. She even had the nerve to mock me for my hobbies, dismissing them as nerdy obsessions. She used to love that part of me, or at least, she pretended to. In one particularly gut-wrenching recording, she joked, "Maybe he's onto something with his accusations, but I won't tolerate it. I'm a writer, damn it, and he's holding me back with his circuits and computer jargon. What does he understand about big ideas?" They both laughed, as if I was some naive fool who didn't deserve her. That was the final straw. The private investigator had done his job. He had gathered all the evidence I needed to prove her betrayal. Now it was up to me to decide how to use it. I thought about confronting her with it all, showing her the photos, the videos, the audio recordings, but I realized that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't need her to admit her infidelity. I already knew the truth. What I needed was to take control of my own life again. I started planning my exit. I had an open conversation with my boss, explaining that I needed a change of scenery. Luckily, he was understanding. He had gone through something similar with his own wife a few years ago and offered me a transfer to our company's office in Portland, Maine. The timing couldn't have been better. I had always loved Maine, the quiet beauty of the coast, the peacefulness of the small towns. It was the perfect place to start over. I began making the necessary arrangements. I hired movers to transport half of our furniture and all of my personal belongings to my new home in Maine. I made sure my car was in perfect condition for the drive, and I consulted with a lawyer to initiate the divorce proceedings. Everything was falling into place. When it came to financial matters, I made sure to protect myself. Emily had her own retirement account and insurance policies, so I didn't have to worry about that. I removed her name from all of my assets and made our daughters the beneficiaries instead. I signed a quick claim for the house, essentially giving it to her in exchange for no alimony. She would keep her car, but she would be responsible for her own insurance and maintenance. I didn't plan to cut her off completely. She could have the house and the car, but she would be left to figure out the rest on her own. As far as I was concerned, my responsibility to her ended the moment she chose to betray me. As I sat in that quiet diner, eating my plate of grits, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just unfolded. The empty highway, the late-night drive, it all felt surreal. Like the life I had been living for the past 25 years had just been left behind in the rearview mirror. Emily, my daughters, the house, all of it now felt like remnants of a different lifetime. And yet, there was something strangely freeing about it. It was as though the weight I had been carrying for months, years, maybe, had finally been lifted. I didn't know what would come next, but I did know one thing. There was no going back. I had taken the final step, severed the ties, and now all that was left was to figure out what my new life would look like. Sitting there in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't help but wonder what Emily was doing at that exact moment. Had she seen the photos I sent yet? Had she and Greg begun to unravel, searching for answers they wouldn't find? Part of me hoped that it ruined her last night with him, that the cold reality of what she'd done would crash down on her, tainting the fantasy she had built around her little affair. But another part of me knew that, in the end, it didn't really matter. What mattered was that I had found my way out. When the time came, I paid in cash, left a tip on the counter, and walked back to my car. I took one last look at the diner, wondering if I would ever pass through this way again. Probably not. I had a new destination now, and Maine was calling my name. I started the engine and headed back onto the highway. The next few hours passed in a blur. As the sun began to rise, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Free from the lies, the deception, the nagging feeling that something was wrong but not being able to put my finger on it. Now, I knew the truth, and I had made peace with it. In some ways, it was easier than I had expected. Sure, there was pain. How could there not be? But there was also relief. Emily had made her choice, and I had made mine. Now, all that was left was to move forward. By the time I reached my hotel in Portland, Maine, I was exhausted. I checked in, grabbed my key, and collapsed onto the bed. It was a simple room, nothing fancy, but it was exactly what I needed. A clean slate, a fresh start. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I thought about what the next few months would look like. I had a new job waiting for me, a new home to settle into, and a whole new life to build. It was daunting, sure, but it was also exciting. There were no more lies, no more secrets, just me, my guitar, and the open road ahead. In a few days, the movers would arrive with the rest of my things, and I could begin the process of settling in. Until then, I planned to enjoy the peace and quiet, to let myself breathe again. After everything I had been through, I figured I had earned it. Sitting there in that hotel room in downtown Annapolis, the weight of everything hit me again as I powered on my phone. Just like I expected, a flood of missed calls, emails, and text messages poured in, mostly from Emily. A few were from concerned friends who were trying to figure out where I had gone, but I had been intentional about staying off the grid. Reading through each message and voicemail was tough, but I knew I had to do it. It was part of the process, the beginning of this new chapter. Emily's initial messages were almost laughable. She was trying to convince me that things weren't as they seemed, spinning the same tired narrative she had probably rehearsed in her head a dozen times before even coming home. I could almost hear her voice as I read her texts. "It's not what you think," or "You're overreacting, we can fix this." But I knew better. Her lies were laid bare the moment she saw the photos, the detailed PI report I left behind for her to find. No amount of backpedaling could erase the truth. Then there were my friends. They had been fielding Emily's frantic calls, telling me she was desperately trying to track me down. What she didn't realize was that she was looking in all the wrong places. I had told Sam and his wife where I was, but no one else knew. For now, that was the way I needed it to be. I was still getting used to this whole ghost thing, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. The two calls that really got to me, though, were from my daughters. I hadn't wanted to drag them into this mess. Not yet, anyway. But Emily, being Emily, had gone to them in an attempt to find me. I could only imagine the things she told them. They were confused, worried, and honestly, they didn't believe me when I first told them what was going on. I couldn't blame them. The idea that their mother could do something like this didn't line up with the woman they thought they knew. So, I did what had to be done. I sent them the same pictures I had sent Emily on that fateful night I left. The photos of her and Greg together, the PI's report, the whole truth. It was brutal, but they needed to see it. After a long conversation and some tearful admissions on their part, they promised not to tell their mother where I was or what I was planning. I felt a weight lift knowing they were on my side, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. The last call that grabbed my attention was from my lawyer. He told me Emily had officially been served with the divorce papers. Now she knew it wasn't just a bluff. I meant business. My lawyer also informed me that Greg's wife had been served with her own set of documents. She had received everything: the photos, the videos, and the audio recordings. It was clear that she hadn't had a clue about her husband's affair with Emily. Now, she had all the evidence she needed. By the third day of my journey, I crossed through northern Maryland and eagerly made my way to New Jersey. I drove with a sense of anticipation, as though every mile brought me closer to the fresh start I desperately needed. However, I didn't stop in New Jersey. I kept pushing forward until I arrived in Connecticut. Once there, I took my time, exploring historic towns along the coast. There wasn't any particular destination in mind, but the colonial architecture, with its unique charm, made me feel like I had truly left my old life behind. The towns were quiet, but there was something peaceful in that solitude, allowing me to process everything that had happened. For a moment, I stood on the shore, my eyes scanning the horizon. The waves were rhythmic, predictable, but there was a darkness underneath, like the submarines they say lurk in the waters. Stealthy, unseen, and moving with purpose. As strange as it sounds, the thought of those submarines made me think of my situation. They refuel by cutting a hole in the hull, only to weld it back together after recharging their reactor. Could that be what I was doing? Was this pain, this betrayal, a way to refuel my own life, giving me the energy I needed to move forward? The next day, though, I knew would be one of the hardest yet. After a hearty breakfast, eggs, bacon, and black coffee, I drove to Brown University to see Sophie, my oldest daughter. The whole way, my mind raced. I had to explain to her what was going on, face to face, but I wasn't sure how she would handle it. When I arrived, she seemed cheerful enough. We walked around campus, visited her favorite spots, and she introduced me to some of her friends. They were good kids, exactly the kind of people I was glad she had surrounding her. But beneath it all, I knew the difficult conversation was coming. We eventually retreated to her dorm room, where I sat her down and told her everything. I showed her the pictures, the audio recordings, things no father should ever have to share with his child. Sophie's reaction was everything I expected and more. Her sadness quickly turned to anger. "I can't believe Mom would do this," she said, her voice full of hurt. "What kind of person is she?" I had to remind her, even though I agreed with her anger, that Emily was still her mother. "She betrayed me, not you," I said, but Sophie was quick to correct me. "Dad, she broke our family. This affects all of us." And she was right. This wasn't just about Emily and me. It was about the family we had built, the lives we had shaped together. And now, that life was shattered. We spent hours talking, and in the end, I encouraged her to rally her friends and go out for a meal together. We headed to one of the better restaurants in town, at least as far as my budget would allow. Sharing stories over dinner, I could see that Sophie appreciated the distraction. College life was hard enough without the weight of family drama hanging over her, and I didn't want this to ruin her time. The next morning, I hugged her tightly, feeling the tears on both our cheeks, before getting back in the car and heading to Boston to see Lucy. Sophie must have warned her because Lucy's reaction was more composed. She was still disappointed, still angry, but she wasn't as shocked. We went through the same process. I showed her the photos and explained everything. At one point, her phone rang, and I noticed the name on the screen. Emily. Lucy looked at me for direction, and I quickly motioned for her not to answer. I shook my head, ran my finger across my throat in a silent, cut it off gesture, and she nodded, letting the call go to voicemail. Lucy had always been the more level-headed one in the family, and her reaction didn't surprise me. But what had shocked me was the way she confronted her mother. "Mom, did Dad call you last night?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Tell me, is it true? Did you really cheat on him? With more than one guy?" I wanted to scold her, to tell her not to speak to her mother like that, but I couldn't. Lucy was saying everything I couldn't bring myself to voice, and the truth in her words was undeniable. "You spent 6 weeks with someone else while Dad was at home, clueless," Lucy continued, her voice cracking. "Was it worth it, Mom? Was losing your family worth it?" Emily stammered, trying to offer some weak excuse, but it was clear Lucy wasn't having any of it. She had already made up her mind about the situation, and Emily's explanations didn't hold any weight. After a tense few minutes, The conversation fizzled out. Later, I took Lucy and her friends to a small Thai restaurant near campus. Despite the tension earlier, the dinner was light-hearted, filled with laughter. I watched my daughter with her friends and realized that she, too, had surrounded herself with good people, just like her sister. On the drive back to her dorm, one of her friends turned to me and said, "Mr. Baker, Lucy told us what you've been going through. She was really upset last night, but we're all here for her." I nodded, grateful. "You kids are good for her." "Thank you." We all laughed as they joked about treating me to cafeteria food the next time I visited, but the truth was, I knew it would be a long time before I returned. I hugged Lucy goodbye that night and continued my journey north the next morning. As I drove through New England, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me, but I felt a strange sense of liberation, too. My daughters were strong, and they were going to be okay. They had weathered the storm, just as I would. When I reached Portsmouth, New Hampshire, I realized I wasn't quite ready to face my new life in Maine. Instead, I turned west, toward the White Mountains. I needed time to clear my head before stepping into my new chapter. The mountains were breathtaking, and as I stood at the summit of Mount Washington, staring out over the green pine forests below, I felt a sense of rebirth. The cold wind bit at my face, out of place in the early days of August, but it didn't matter. I had gone through a transformation. I was no longer the man I had been just weeks ago. The betrayal was still fresh, but I was ready to leave it behind and start again. As the fall gave way to winter, I had already begun to settle into my new life in Maine. I never imagined how much I would come to enjoy the simplicity of it all. My two-bedroom apartment, which I had originally intended to be a temporary arrangement, felt more like home with each passing week. The routine of work, sailing, and weekends filled with the laughter of my daughters and their friends began to give my life a new shape, one I hadn't anticipated. It's funny, really. When Emily left me emotionally, and later, physically, it felt like my world had ended. But now, as I sit here in this quiet apartment, looking out at the snow-covered streets, I realize she did me a favor. In her absence, I've rediscovered parts of myself that I'd long buried beneath the responsibilities of marriage and family. I have time to reflect, to pursue my own interests without constantly trying to fit myself into her expectations. My daughters, Sophie and Lucy, come up once a month, sometimes with friends in tow, and it's during those weekends that my place feels most alive. Their laughter fills the apartment, and though I cherish the quiet once they leave, I find myself missing them the moment the door closes behind them. Despite everything, they've handled the divorce better than I expected. They've managed to maintain a relationship with their mother, though it's clear the trust between them has been fractured, possibly beyond repair. As for Emily, she still calls me from time to time, though the conversations are brief and perfunctory. She has never truly apologized for what she did, never fully acknowledged the hurt she caused. Instead, she downplays it, offering excuses like, "Everyone does it," as if that somehow makes it better. But the truth is, it doesn't. The intimacy she shared with Greg mattered, and the lies she spun to cover it up mattered even more. I used to think that if I could just get her to understand that, I'd find some kind of closure. But now I see that I no longer need her validation. I've moved on, and that's all the closure I need. Winter in Maine has been a bit of a shock, I'll admit. The early darkness and the biting cold take some getting used to, but there's a certain charm to it as well. The long, dark evenings make the warm glow of indoor gatherings feel even cozier. I've started attending local events, contra dances, potluck dinners, and even a few sailing meetups. The people here are authentic, down-to-earth, and welcoming in a way that makes me feel like I've been here for years instead of just a few months. I've begun the search for a boat. There's a marina not far from town with moorings available, and I'm looking forward to spring when I can start working on splicing lines and applying varnish. The thought of spending my weekends out on the water, with nothing but the wind and the waves to keep me company, fills me with a sense of peace that I haven't felt in years. Emily and Greg? Well, they haven't fared quite as well. From what I hear, Greg's wife was just as old-fashioned as I am. She kicked him out and filed for divorce almost immediately after receiving the photos and videos from my private investigator. And as for Emily, she's still living in the house I left behind, but from what our mutual friends tell me, she's struggling. It seems the life she thought she wanted didn't turn out to be as glamorous as she imagined. Neither she nor Greg have been published, and their little affair, it turns out, was nothing more than a passing fling. In the end, I've come out of this ordeal stronger, more self-aware, and ready for whatever life has in store for me next. The wounds Emily inflicted are still healing, and I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from the betrayal. But for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. My future is mine to shape, and I'm ready to embrace it. What do you think about this story? Write in comments. If you don't follow our channel, Cheating Room, you will probably never hear from us again. If you are subscribed, congratulations, you will not miss any exciting story. Thank you for listening to this shocking story with us. See you again.